We should not be under any delusions about Russia's willingness to use nuclear weapons. Nothing has changed. They've always been willing to use nuclear weapons at a relatively low threshold. We're the people that sort of mirror image ourselves and talk ourselves into all kinds of fanciful conclusions about when and where we would or would not use nuclear weapons. The Russians would be willing to use nuclear weapons if they saw a path forward to victory.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of What's Really Happening. I'm Dr. Tad Schnoffer, the Strategy and Research Manager here at the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. As always, we're joined by GNSI's Executive Director, retired Marine Corps General Frank McKenzie. Today, we're going to discuss the world in general as we look back on the developments of 2024 and what they'll mean for 2025. General, it's great to have you here today.
Great to be with you, Tad, always.
So let's go ahead and start in the Middle East as we're reviewing 2024, looking forward to also for each of these major issues, what's going to happen in 2025 from your perspective. So in the Middle East, you have Israel and Iran, obviously in this regional conflict, but recently we've had some headway towards peace with the ceasefire with Hezbollah and Israel. Is that holding, and is there a prospect for a larger peace in the region?
Well, I think, Tad, the biggest development in 2024 in the Middle East is the shift in the balance of power and the diminishment of Iran. In 2024, Iran launched two major attacks on Israel, both of which failed. In return, Israel launched a pretty balanced response that has exposed Iran's inability to defend itself, first of all, and also its relative inability to strike Israel. That's very significant. As we end the year 2024, Iran is the weakest it's been in decades in the region. And also a significant factor here is the fact that Lebanese Hezbollah, which Iran has long viewed as its counterweight against Israel to the north, has been effectively decapitated and defeated by the Israeli army and the Israeli military, the IDF, as they've gone north into Lebanon. And as you know, Tad, that's resulted in a ceasefire that's holding tenuously. The proof will be in the pudding. We'll have to see if attacks from Lebanon cease into northern Israel, and if Israeli citizens who live in that northern tier of kibbutzes, towns, and cities are able to return to their homes and live there unmolested. I think the jury is still very much out on that. And if that doesn't happen, you can look for Israel to renew their attacks in Lebanon with 100% certainty. They're not going to be able to accept anything less than complete security across the northern tier. Having said all that, it is a significant strategic victory for Israel in this long struggle with Iran. I go back to where I began. Iran is weaker than they've been in many years. They don't have a lot of options to hit back at Israel. You know, from the last Israeli attack, there were lots of talk about the Iranians striking back. Tad, they've chosen not to do that. And they've chosen not to do it because they don't have a good way to do it. They counted on Lebanese Hezbollah to be able to deliver those strikes. Lebanese Hezbollah is not in a position to do that now. So Iran is, again, in a very difficult situation as 2024 ends.
And with the Israelis, again, having that tentative ceasefire in the north, what's it looking like in the south and Gaza and Hamas?
Yeah, so operations still continue in Gaza. I think, as I've said before, the Israelis have defeated Hamas. They have not destroyed Hamas. And to go from defeat to destruction is nonlinear. And so they continue operations. Hamas continues to hide amongst the population, to invite Israelis to have to make difficult decisions about what to strike and what not to strike because of the global exposure. It gives their cause when the Israelis take those decisions. So that's significant. It's continuing. I don't believe I see that we're in measurable distance of that conflict ending.
So you likely continue well into 2025, you're seeing?
I think so. But if you're Hamas, you have to be disappointed that someone you counted on to be a major ally, Lebanese Hezbollah, has chosen to execute a ceasefire agreement with Israel. That has to be a blow to them and to their hopes for a theater-wide war, which they had hoped to incite, and which in the case of Lebanese Hezbollah and Iran certainly has not happened. Houthis are another story, and we can talk about them.
Sure. Let's move south and talk about the Houthis and their operations.
So the Houthis continue to be very successful in their ability to close the Bab el-Mandeb, the key choke point that, when closed, actually limits, of course, traffic through the Suez Canal, has global impacts. We have not been able to stop the Houthis from doing it. And I'd say the major development in the latter part of 2024 has been increased Russian backing for the Houthis. They're doing it because we're involved in Ukraine, and they want to impose costs on us wherever they can around the world. So I think we're seeing increased Russian assistance to the Houthis, which is making their weapons, already fairly effective, albeit short-ranged ones, even more effective. I'm concerned, frankly, Tad, that we have U.S. warships in a location where they're going to be increasingly vulnerable because we're playing catch. We're not playing pitch. Mm-hmm. And eventually something bad's going to happen to a U.S. warship down there. Then we're going to be in a real difficult situation.
We still see the Iranians supplying the Houthis as well?
The Iranians are certainly continuing to supply the Houthis, not only with weapons, but also with intelligence. Mm-hmm. The Russians are now supplying them at a heightened level. And all of this is really not very effective against Israel, which is ultimately the Houthi desire, but it is certainly effective against the Bab el-Mandeb. And unless you're a Chinese flag ship, you're just not getting through.
And why would they favor the Chinese in that?
Chinese have cut a deal with the Houthis, Tad.
Oh, wow.
The Chinese are very pragmatic. They could care less about right and wrong. It's all about Chinese aggrandizement and expansion. And so the Chinese have seized this opportunity.
Interesting. And looking at the Middle East and a little bit more zoomed out and going back into Syria, what's the big takeaways from there as we see the Syrian civil war and instability there kind of taking a dramatic turn in recent weeks with the seizure of Aleppo?
HTS, a terrorist organization, we've designated them a terrorist organization, is associated with Al-Qaeda, not with ISIS. It's a distinction, a very narrow distinction, but nonetheless a distinction, has made great headway here in the last few days and weeks. As you noted, seizing Aleppo, continuing to move south. That's significant. And what the story behind that is the Syrian army is no good. It's never been particularly good. It's even worse now. It's hollowed out. Bashar Assad sits on his perch leading that terribly blighted nation because of the support of Russia and Iran and Lebanese Hezbollah. Well, in all three cases, none of them are in a position to provide the assistance they did in the past. Russia's attention is focused on Ukraine. They've removed a lot of their air defense assets from their base in western Syria, and a lot of their other resources have gone north. Lebanese Hezbollah, for reasons we've already discussed, is not in a position to provide a lot of aid and assistance, although they can probably put something in there. And Iran also finds it difficult to do so for reasons that we've discussed. So the principal backers of Assad and his regime are no longer in a position to provide the assistance that they've done in the past, which means that the forces on the ground, the HTS, has been able to seize Aleppo and move further south. I think it's very much in the balance in Syria. It's not clear to me that Bashar Assad is going to be able to retain power. Odds are he will, but I think he's very much threatened by this new development right now.
And is this new development in land going to this HTS, is that going to be a new type of Islamic state, or what do we foresee them creating in the territory they hold?
Well, they say a lot of things in their publications. I think we'll have to wait and see. Mm-hmm. What's interesting, the position of the Turks. Mm-hmm. I don't know that they have directly supported this offensive, but I do know that they pay close attention to what happens in northern Syria, and their principal objective is to prevent the further flow of refugees across the border into Turkey. Further expansion south by a group like this would tend to reduce the flow of refugees north into Turkey. So we can assume that the Turks aren't disappointed by what's happening right now in and around Aleppo, even if they're not supporting it. And I'm not in a position to have any knowledge one way or another about what they are or not doing.
And from a U.S. perspective, how should the U.S. look upon this as we enter 2025 and the Syrian conflict again expanding? So
we still have about 1,000 soldiers in eastern Syria, east of the Euphrates River. Our goal remains to prevent ISIS from regenerating and to keep a lid on the prison camps that are there where hardened ISIS fighters are retained by our SDF partners, as well as to continue to provide succor to the IDP camps, the displaced persons camp that are scattered up and down the Euphrates River Valley. So that remains our objective there. I think we'll stay out of this particular fight. We'll watch it closely because it will have implications. Should the Assad regime fail, then there are a lot of options that could open. Not all of them are palatable. So I think we'll watch it closely, but we don't really have a particular dog in this fight right now.
What about the Kurdish elements in the northeast of Syria? Obviously, they have a land in Iraq as well. Do they have a role here?
I think they're, again, dedicated to the task we've set out for them, which is prevent ISIS from coming back to power in the Euphrates River Valley. And in eastern Syria, they provide a governance structure. What it means practically, though, is Assad's not going to be able to take them on anytime near because he has problems much closer to home, literally much closer to home to deal with in Aleppo, which is, if you look at a map, just north of Damascus and directly threatens state survival of Syria.
So the Syrians are in for a long fight, seems.
Well, they've been fighting since 2011,
yeah.
so not much has changed. I do think this is qualitatively different a little bit because of the relative weakness of Assad's backers. Again, the Iranians, Lebanese Hezbollah, and the Russians. They all have other pressing concerns right now, and Bashar Assad's not at the top of their list.
So just moving a little bit to the east, let's talk about Iran a little bit more. So where does Iran stand now? So coming all the way from the October 7th attack from last year all the way through now, where are they?
So the latest Israeli attack on Iran, which was magnificently executed by the Israelis, stripped away most of the Iranian air defenses. So Iran is now open really to another Israeli attack. It's my judgment that Israel set a trap for Iran. They invited Iran to respond to the latest attack. Then they would have gone in very heavy and taken out a number of other targets. Iran so far has managed to not strike back. They managed to avoid that trap. Part of that may be just recognizing the nature of the trap, recognizing the correlation of forces is so much against them right now, more so than it's been in many years. And the third thing is I think they fear the return of President Trump and what he's going to mean in the region because of his views are going to probably be more hardline than the current administration about Iran. So I think they have to balance all that as they ponder how to respond to Israel.
And looking at the new incoming Trump administration, what's that going to mean for the Middle East from your perspective? How do you see that playing out?
I think much of the current architecture in the Middle East is a direct product of what the Trump administration did his first time around. I think the strike against Qasem Soleimani upset Iran in a way that no one else had been able to do. They have not recovered from that strike yet in terms of military leadership. That's number one. Number two, the signing of the Abraham Accords, a very significant diplomatic and economic event in the theater, provides an open architecture for further development of nations in the region, particularly with Israel. And the third thing is, and it's not as widely known as the other two, then President Trump's decision to move Israel into the Central Command region gave a venue for the Central Command commander, first myself, now my successor, General Eric Kurilla, the ability to convene chiefs of defense and to create an architecture for responding to the malign attacks of Iran, which have continued and which have tended to focus everyone in the region on Iran as a bad actor.
So with that in mind, it seems like, unfortunately for the Middle East, there's still a lot of fighting ahead.
I think there's always a lot of fighting ahead in the Middle East, Tad. I think as we go into the new year, I do think we have an opportunity here, though, and I do think the opportunity is with the Trump administration coming in, the groundwork they've laid, the fact that they've shown they're willing to actually engage Iran directly and aggressively and kinetically if necessary, all of that produces an effect on the Iranian mind. And I think there may actually be an opportunity for stability in the region if we can grasp that nettle.
So able to reestablish deterrence strength and then negotiate from there?
I think that's how I would describe it. I think the possibility is there, given Iran's weakened status, given Iran's recognition of what President Trump has done before and might be willing to do again, the uncertainty that surrounds his return to the presidency, all of those things are good things for us and bad things for Iran.
So how does that go into the Iranian calculation for supporting Russia and continuing to supply them with drones as we kind of move north to the European theater, looking at the Ukraine war?
That's a transactional. That's a transactional relationship. Russia needs help. Iran needs technology. There's no long-term basis, I think, for a relationship between those two states. Russia, in the long term, does not want a strong Iran on its southern border, and they certainly don't want a nuclear-armed Iran on their southern border because they're much closer to Iran than we are, as an example. So I think Russia, if they think strategically, and I hope they are thinking strategically, it's difficult to know since only one person's making decisions in Russia. I think that it is and will remain a transactional relationship. Doesn't mean it's not a damaging relationship to us. Iranian drones have been effective against Ukraine, and I'm sure that they're putting to good use the military technology and crowd surveillance technology and intelligence technology that I believe that Russia may have provided them.
And it seems like going to Russia, reaching out for partners, some of them transactional. We've seen North Korean troops being introduced into the Ukraine conflict. You've noted that Russia's been supporting the Houthis. What does this mean for Russian partnerships? Are they reaching out to try to balance the
I think they're desperate, and they're searching for any kind of partnership anywhere that will help them. There's a long relationship between North Korea and Russia that shouldn't surprise us, going back to the 1950s. So there's nothing new there. Of course, moving 10,000 troops into Russia is a big deal. I'm not sure that's going to tip the balance. I'm not sure those North Korean soldiers are going to fight well or effectively against Ukraine. It's concerning, and I don't want to minimize that, but I don't think that in and of itself is going to be a game changer.
And as we look at the Ukraine conflict, the Russia-Ukraine conflict over the course of 2024, it starts off pretty stagnant front. At the beginning of the year, you had the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk. And now we're seeing slow Russian gains on the front lines over the last couple months. Where do you see this conflict going?
I think everyone's waiting really to see what happens when President Trump comes into office. The decisions he makes at that time are probably going to be decisive about the future of the conflict. NATO is probably waiting to see it as well. I would argue we remain the indispensable nation.
Sure.
What the United States does is actually going to dictate what everyone else does to some degree because of our unique capabilities globally and also regionally.
Do you think it's possible for the U.S. to push through a peace deal in the next couple months?
I think anything's possible. I think right now neither side is exhausted enough to do it. Putin, because he has to show something for his attack into Ukraine. Ukraine is going to require some pretty significant security guarantees if they were going to accept anything less than total reestablishment of the original border, which I think is difficult to get to, frankly. So I think that what conditional security guarantees are we going to be able to provide Ukraine? What's the role of NATO going to be in that? What's the path to potential future NATO membership for Ukraine? Is there a path? Don't know. Not a military question. That's a diplomatic question. And then what's the United States position going to be on that? And that's going to be defined by President Trump.
Sure. And looking at the battlefield, though, this doesn't seem like there's any possible way for the Ukrainians to gain back all the land that they've lost over the course of the war.
It will be very difficult given the balance of forces, given the fact that the Russians have not fought well offensively. They have fought very effectively defensively because of their habit of indiscriminate mining, massive mining. It made it very difficult for the Ukrainians to achieve a breakthrough. It's a World War I battlefield, really, in eastern Ukraine.
So do we see any ways that the Putin and Russia can uptick their ability to turn the tide? I mean, they brought in North Korean soldiers. Could they mobilize their more reserves or something? Is there any way to turn the tide?
I think the dilemma that Putin faces is not unlike the dilemma President Johnson faced in the 1960s in the United States, where you wanted to pursue a war in Vietnam, a war of choice. At the same time, you wanted to fund the Great Society program, and you wanted to do that without actually mobilizing the reserves of the U.S. military. Putin faces a similar problem. He doesn't want to cause greater pain to the Russian people, and he doesn't want to cause greater pain to his economy. So he's in a very difficult situation. He will mobilize as much as he can within those constraints. The fact that he's taken soldiers from North Korea, I think, is significant. It should mean something.
Sure.
And so I think we need to track that very carefully as in the next month ahead. I think Putin clearly is waiting to see what President Trump's action is going to be when he becomes the president.
It's interesting to see how much international conflicts that don't maybe not even directly involve the U.S., but a lot of it hinges on elections. Have we seen that in the past with elections as well?
I think, yes. I think if you go back in the history of the United States, presidential elections have been very important in determining the role of the United States in global affairs. You look at what President Roosevelt, not his first election, but certainly his second and third elections were very important for the path the United States eventually took. It wasn't necessarily evident at the time. I think certainly President Johnson's decision not to run in 1968 was very important and changed the path of U.S. history. Don't know if Johnson would have won in that election anyway, but clearly he did not run because of what happened in Vietnam. And we had the opportunity then perhaps to take another path in Vietnam. We did not because of Johnson.
Interesting. But it's interesting how the administrations and like I said, the elections can make a difference or actually not.
I agree.
So as we keep moving a little bit east so the Ukraine war, it looks like we still continue on, possibly a peace, but it's going to be some sort of bartered peace. No one's going to get exactly what they want out of that.
I can see no other path forward unless Putin is willing to raise the stakes inordinately by using a nuclear weapon or something like that in order to demonstrate the depth of his commitment to stealing Ukraine.
Well, when they just recently lowered the doctrine for nuclear use, Putin signed it into law. So do you think that's
I think that's more noise than anything else. We should not be under any delusions about Russia's willingness to use nuclear weapons. Nothing has changed. They've always been willing to use nuclear weapons at a relatively low threshold. We're the people that sort of mirror image ourselves and talk ourselves into all kinds of fanciful conclusions about when and where we would or would not use nuclear weapons. The Russians would be willing to use nuclear weapons if they saw a path forward to victory.
You think their use of the medium-range hypersonic missiles, are they trying to show the U.S. something, or is it just more?
It's a weapon that's been around for a long time, right. Ted. They brought it out. It was actually they stopped production of it. Now they've restarted production of it. It's not perhaps as charming a weapon as they would have us believe.
Yeah. So in the end, unfortunately, just no major updates on the
because Putin's not willing to raise the stakes. Good, because he recognizes the intense dilemma that would put the West in responding to him, and we might respond in ways that could be very dangerous to him. He's still faced by a large, comprehensive, well-organized global alliance that includes the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I would argue the most successful collective security mechanism really in the history of the world.
Absolutely. Well, and looking at Russia, we talked about North Korea. Let's go a little bit more further east to South Korea. So we just had the South Korean president declare martial law. They repealed it not too long, a few hours later. Are we looking at one of the U.S. key allies having some instability issues?
I think instability in the Korean Peninsula, particularly in the South, is never a good thing.
Right, yeah.
I think the South Koreans, the Republic of Korea will sort that out going forward. Bottom line is not a good event. Probably gives hope to North Korea. And it will be interesting to see what happens here in the next few weeks going forward. The president withdrew the declaration of martial law, and I think it's very important. There's still some difficult days ahead in South Korea.
Is there any role that the U.S. plays? As obviously we have a lot of troops there, major U.S. ally.
We need to stay out of it. They're a key ally. We need to support them, but I don't think there's a significant role for the United States in this.
And that's probably for the best. And as we look at for the Chinese and Taiwan moving a little bit further south, what role China's continued to expand its influence or trying to expand its influence over 2024? What do we see for them in 2025?
They'll continue along this track. But again, China faces a dilemma, and the dilemma is there are now nations in the region, Japan, the Philippines, Korea, Australia, the United States, among others, that have sort of adopted the view that China is a significant threat, and it's not a coalition. I might not go so far as to call it that. Although there are treaty aspects to it, and we have Article 5 treaties with some of these nations. Nonetheless, it represents a bonding together of nations standing against China. China has nobody, and that's a real problem for them. But having said that, China will continue to assert itself. China will continue to pump lots of money into its military. China will continue to operate against us, as we've just seen in a massive intelligence operation against the United States. Sure. They'll push until we make them stop, and we have not been terribly successful at making them stop to date.
Is the possible another trade war under a new Trump administration going to make them reflect on that, do you think?
I think the possibility of a trade war, the possibility of tariffs, or possibility of a much sharper policy against China, all of those are possibilities, maybe probabilities now.
And the Chinese, like you said, they don't necessarily have partners, but they try to show that they might have partners with the BRICS and maybe the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Oh, there's anything to keep, they just had a recent summit a couple months ago.
Right. I think they'll try to keep pushing that. I think we and the possibilities of the United States and the West have more to offer than China.
Right. Yeah. Well, and obviously their relationships tend to be very transactional, just like the Russians as well.
Very transactional and very biased toward Chinese interests and needs.
Right. Yeah. They're not trying to help you out.
They're not.
No. And as we look elsewhere in the globe, is there any other major issues you see coming up in 2025 as we look forward?
Well, I think the world is going to be very interested in what the Trump administration does. I think it's going to be significant. And I think in the Middle East, we sort of know the outlines of his policy. We've already talked about that. And I think it's going to be very consistent with what he's done in the past. And he's done some good things in the Middle East in the past. And I think that's going to continue. So I think look at that. Look at what decisions he makes about Ukraine. I think those are sort of the two big things that people are going to be looking for.
Well, we appreciate the input, General.
Thanks very much, Ted. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Absolutely. Thank you. And that's going to wrap up another episode of What's Really Happening. Today, we held an intriguing discussion with GNSI's Executive Director, retired Marine Corps General Frank McKenzie, on the major developments of 2024 and what 2025 might hold. As always, I'm Dr. Tad Schnaufer with the Global and National Security Institute. We thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to our next episode where we find out what's really happening.